Adam was a history teacher, still a history teacher at heart, and so he has a history lesson for us about the Christmas Day truce during World War One. So, Adam, take it away.
Sure. I thought it was timely considering this is our Christmas Day episode that we have something in Christmas history to talk about that relates to the labor movement. And yes, I can find a connection between what happened in Europe in 1914 and us Union folks here in Alabama in 2021. So, for those of you not familiar with it, World War One, of course, was not called World War One at the time because they didn't know there'd be a second one. The Great War started in 1914, and you saw the two big sides. The Central Powers were, of course, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. On the other side, you had the British Empire, the French Empire, the Russian Empire. The United States would join later in 1917. And in the winter of 1914, you saw something pretty remarkable, which was a wave of some spontaneous, some loosely organized truces along the battlefield, mostly along the Western Front, involving German troops with some British and French and Belgian troops. But there were reports also out east among the Russians versus the Austrians. And you may recall, if you know much of anything about World War One, it's probably trenches. That's sort of what's in the popular, imagination about this war. We know about trenches. We know about no man's land, which was in between the two opposing sides of trenches. And in the lead up to Christmas of 1914, it's worth thinking about the fact that these folks had, in some cases, been on the line for half a year. When the war started, most people, from rank and file troops to government leaders to the media, most folks thought this was going to be one of those wars that was over by Christmas. They were settled down after months of some of the most horrific fighting we had ever seen, because this was really the latest, greatest 20th century technology, industrialization applied to human warfare. The full scope of developed capitalism being used to slaughter other human beings. And so it's kind of a bizarre thing to even think about Christmas, much less celebrate Christmas in the context of such brutality. But what really speaks to me as a worker, as a member of the labor movement, is the idea that those of us who work for a living have a lot in common. And we have a lot in common regardless of where we're born, our race, our gender, our nationality, religion. And this Christmas Day truce, I think, was really an example of this being demonstrated in the real world under the most, difficult circumstances. So running up to Christmas Eve and throughout Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, you saw soldiers on various sides begin to broker these truces. You had folks who were literally putting up Christmas trees on the top of their trenches and lighting candles. There were guards who were singing Christmas hymns, Christmas songs. And like I said, some were very spontaneous. It just sort of popped off and folks joined in. In some cases, it was, more of a, hey, let's just take a break. Nobody shoots at each other for a while we bury our dead. Because as you can imagine, after all this fighting, unfortunately, you had not a lot of time to go pay your respects and actually bury your fallen comrades. So there was some appetite on each side to at least have that peace, to to really gather themselves, to bury their dead. But you had this real spirit of Christmas that was taking place in various parts of the Western Front. And in some cases, there were reports of German troops who were actually playing soccer with English troops. You had reports of folks exchanging food, everything from, meat and bread to actual chocolate cake and more like holiday items. Of course, there was an exchange of booze and tobacco. And it's a miraculous thing to imagine these folks who had been firing machine guns at each other only hours before, moved both by the spirit of Christmas, moved by the desire to not be shot at for a while, frankly. Whatever you want to chalk it up to, there was this brief moment in time where what are supposed to be enemies, mortal enemies, were able to walk across the battlefield and just enjoy some fellowship with each other. And one of the things that really stuck with me is the reports that came out afterwards from some of these soldiers who participated, who talked about the way in which the propaganda they had been fed clearly wasn't accurate. Of course, regardless of what side you were on in the war, you were expected to believe the other side were less than human, just vicious, evil, bloodthirsty, whatever you can imagine. That's what you were supposed to think about with these folks. And so here you had French troops and British troops gathering and enjoying some Christmas drinks and Christmas songs with German troops, and realize, these are human beings just like us. And those are some of the most moving reports of when you actually sat down or stood around and you'd exchange some real human connection with these folks. And so some of these rank and file soldiers were able to write back to their family, write back home that the newspapers had been lying. Mm-hmm. The newspapers had, clearly not told the full story.
Right.
And as you can imagine, this did not go over so well with the governments at the time and the high command. Again, regardless of what side, German, British, French, the officers were not nearly as keen on this as the enlisted folks. Your rank and file soldiers were definitely eager to have a break from getting shot at. A lot of these folks were just kids, basically, teenagers, just now starting their lives. And by December, of course, you've called up reserves after half a year of fighting. So you had folks who had families at home. These are fathers, in some cases probably grandfathers, on the front line. So to have that break, of course, threatened the coercion of the high command, because again, you don't want your troops to believe that the other side is a human being just like you, because then they may start to question, well, why are we really doing this? If Hans is just like me, he wants a beer, he wants chocolate cake, he wants to see his family for Christmas, he misses his kids. Why do I have to go blow him up tomorrow? What is it about? Why are we doing this? And that struck fear into the governments at the time, and it was, a special point of emphasis in the remaining years of the war to prevent any sort of truce like this from happening again. And, it's not to say that it happened everywhere, of course, and there was some that was probably more friendly than others. But it really, to me, is a lesson in how we as human beings can connect across the divisions that are propped up. Because at the end of the day, none of us get to choose where we're born. Nationalities and countries are all human creations over the centuries and millennia. But these folks were able to transform, a moment of just utter violence and depravity into a moment of love and solidarity and Christmas spirit. And so that is a lesson that I think inspires those of us who've come after. And I think it's certainly a lesson to scare those in charge of armies and navies. And the thing about that war is that it was a war of imperialists. It was a war of capitalists, a war of bankers. It was not a war for freedom and democracy and all the other buzzwords we're told. That's not what that war was about. Many folks realized that at the time. And, it's unfortunate that the fighting went on so much farther after that. But another interesting thing about that was that these truces in some cases lasted past Christmas. Because, again, lo and behold, you've now had a day to rest, to not get shot at, and that feels kind of nice.
Yeah.
Never been in battle myself, and so I can't speak from experience, but I'm going to go ahead and guess it's better to not get shot at.
Well, from my experience, it's nice to like if you're arguing like with your spouse or something, it's nice to get a reprieve from that.
Right.
So I can imagine actually getting shot at.
Absolutely. So if
the
you got
stakes are a bit higher, right?
And I'll say, if you got any arguments at home, Christmas truce. This have a Christmas truce. But I think we in the labor movement can never forget internationalism. So this is my long way of making this point here. And why is this relevant to me as a worker and a union member in the state of Alabama in the year 2021? We as workers are all tied together. Our fates and our destinies are intertwined, regardless of where we're born. And we see this here in Alabama because we are, in many ways, functioning the ways in which the global South functions. Our relationship to Yankee capital and, the broader system of capitalist economics, the South in America is used as a place to exploit. The reason these big companies love to come to a place like Alabama is not because they love sweet tea and biscuits as much as they should. We all love the South and the many beautiful things about this place, but that's not why Toyota and Amazon are coming here. They're coming here because they see an opportunity to exploit a cheaper workforce, a less educated workforce, a more compliant workforce. Alabama is leverage for these companies. And we discussed earlier in the show the leverage that companies have by being able to replace striking workers. And in many ways, the South, Alabama in particular, but across the American South, we have functioned as that leverage for employers.
Right.
Workers in Ohio and New York and California, in the back of their mind, they have to be aware that they could lose the fight in their workshop, in their plant, in their industry, because their employer can pack up and move down south. And we've seen this happen where good union jobs from the Midwest, the Northeast, out West, they are moved down south in a non-union, anti-union, hostile environment to unions. And we've seen where there are regions in this country and certainly in this state that resemble underdeveloped nations more than they resemble what is the wealthiest superpower on the planet. And so, again, employers can exploit these dynamics by going to these areas. There are places here in Alabama where even a crappy manufacturing job that would be insulting to the union members in other parts of the country may look golden compared to the other options in some counties and some regions. If your only option is a Dollar General, a Walmart, or this auto manufacturing supply chain, where no, you're not given the benefits and pay other states receive, but maybe it's $1 or $2 better than Dollar General.
Right.
That's the situation that we're dealing with. In the South, as long as we are essentially a resource for employers to use as leverage against our brothers and sisters across the country, we'll never be able to get ahead. And we see the same dynamics play out in terms of foreign labor. If Alabama gets too expensive, well, then they'll pack up and move to Mexico.
Right.
And if that gets too expensive, they'll pack up and go to Honduras. And so the answer is that we have to organize everywhere.
Yeah, and that is the fundamental principle on which unionism rests and gains its power, because in a singular workplace, those dynamics exist as well. The reason that collective bargaining agreements are going to be better than you can get with individual bargaining agreements is that in the same way that Alabamians can be leveraged against New Yorkers, in the same way that Hondurans can be leveraged against Alabamians, Sarah can be leveraged against Jamal. Or, you get what I'm saying. Individually, working people can be leveraged against each other. And even just our ignorance can be leveraged against ourselves when we don't know how much the people working next to us on the line or in the cube next to us or in the office down the hall, how much they make, how much they're compensated. And that is, and so instead of only having the leverage that you bring to the table as an individual with your labor, when you bring together an entire workforce's leverage, you're going to get a much better deal. And that is why in regions of the country with higher union density, you see higher wages, because where more and more people are doing that, that even helps people who are not in unions. People in non-union workplaces benefit. I mean, study after study has borne this out, that people in non-union workplaces benefit when they have a higher union density rate in their geographic area. And so, of course, we can extrapolate this principle internationally, because and say that where working people come together across the globe, working people will be better off. Because, of course, the world was not made better by our imperial exploits in World War I or in any of the imperial exploits after World War II. Of course the world wasn't made better. The countries that we invaded weren't made better. Our country wasn't made better. The world was not made better. Lives were wasted. People were murdered for no reason except to pit people against each other. In his condemnation of the Vietnam War, Martin Luther King said that poor black boys are being sent overseas to shoot and be shot at by poor brown boys. And that just doesn't make any sense. What do we care as far as they have every right to have whatever sort of political and economic system that they want to in other countries. And we have the right to have our own political and economic system here. And of course, we would say that people in other countries do not have the right to impose their will on us because they don't like it. And so we don't have that authority morally. But as working people, it does not benefit us to do this, to impose our will on other people, because we have more in common with immigrant workers in the United States, with foreign workers in other countries, than we're ever going to have in common with a Bill Gates or a Jeff Bezos or the Koch family or the Waltons. These people are in a totally different strata than we are, and the only way that we are going to make our lives better is by coming together and taking some of what they have stolen back from us and helping people across the globe do the same.
Absolutely. I mean, that's it. We as a class of people, the working class, we have to organize regardless of distinctions, regardless of borders and race, ideologies. There's been a huge sentiment in this country throughout our history, and certainly recently, to scapegoat foreign workers, to scapegoat immigrants. And we even see this sometimes within our own labor movement, where there's, some nativist sentiments from time to time. But at the end of the day, we as members of the working class, as you said, we have more in common with each other than we do the owners. And I will certainly consider our fellow workers in Honduras and Thailand and across the world as our brothers and sisters. Jeff Bezos is not my brother, but those folks are, because that's our relationship to this world and to the economy. And I think it's, that's why this Christmas truce speaks to me, because if they, even however short-lived, were able to set down their arms and join together in their common interest, I think that's an example that we can all uphold. And certainly, to sort of tie in to your last bit here, the military-industrial complex is the driver of this economy. And certainly here in the Tennessee Valley, where we're reporting from, the war economy is what keeps the dollars flowing. And I understand folks have to make a living. Again, vast majority of us, we don't own property, we don't own capital. We have to sell our labor in exchange for little green pieces of paper that we use to survive and feed our families. So, I certainly understand folks have to find a job wherever they can, but there is something pretty immoral about the fact that our entire economy, certainly in this region, is so driven by the blood money of warfare. And, that is the polar opposite of the Christmas spirit that I think we should all remember. So,
and it doesn't have to be that way. I mean, just because
Absolutely.
it's been this way doesn't mean it. I mean, think about how much further ahead we would be if instead of spending money building bombs that are either going to kill people overseas that we don't know, that are in large part innocent civilians, or that will never be used. I mean, we build so many bombs that will simply never be used. Where would we be if instead of doing that for the last 20, 30, 40 years, we had put the ingenuity? We have more engineers in Huntsville, Alabama per capita than any city in the country. And the majority of them are working on these war efforts that are either going to be used for nefarious purposes or won't be used at all. How much further ahead would we be as a country, as a city, as a geographic region in North Alabama, in the Tennessee Valley, if our brains and muscles were being used instead of for the military-industrial complex? What if we were being used to build and expand something like the TVA, to build new schools, to build new post offices, to build new roads, to fix our infrastructure, to build new libraries, to build houses for homeless people, to build houses for homeless veterans, to build new hospitals, to replace the hospitals, the dozens of hospitals across the South that have gone bankrupt and closed because we haven't expanded Medicaid. I mean, think about it is really disgusting thinking about how much effort and money and talent is wasted on things that do not make people's lives better, where we could be without that, where we could be if we put those resources and that time and that talent into something that's actually productive. And we can actually literally see something like that when we go back and look at the New Deal and look at what happened with the wartime profits there, where we actually had a war going on that was probably the only righteous war in the last 100 years. And we turned those wartime profits into a domestic production economy where we created goods and services for ourselves and for people overseas. And we had the biggest, the thing was the American standard of living, right? This was the big thing, and everybody was going to have 2 cars and a TV or something. It was the largest GDP year-over-year increase that we've ever seen was thanks to these programs and the profits after the war. And what if we had just kept doing that instead of what we chose to do? I mean, it's really like sad to think about how much we've missed, but it doesn't, just because something is the way that it is right now doesn't mean that it has to be that way into the future. And we are the architects of the world that we live in, us as working people, us as citizens, as people, and we can always decide to change course. And so,
absolutely. I think that is the thing, is that if you really believe that another world is possible, everything else can flow from that. I think if you have that belief that we can do better, but we have to fight for it.
right.
And what you discussed in terms of the New Deal and really the golden age of the American economy, it wasn't just because we had folks in office who were a little bit smarter, a little bit more pro-worker. It was because we had a labor movement powerful enough to extract that from our economy, to demand that folks have a Social Security pension when they retire, and that we have minimum wage laws, and that we get rid of child labor. That was movement power.
Right.
And that's the movement power that we can have again. And not only can we do that, we have to do that.
Right.
We have to do that. If we're going to even begin to address some of the major, major crises that we face as a country and as a planet, that's going to be through really the bottom up, not from the top down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Work sucks, we know, but you can make it better by organizing with your fellow workers. For more information, call or text the Huntsville Industrial Workers of the World at 256-651-6707.